Hi, I'm Jono from ACS Custom. I'm here at iSing magazine and I'm going to be interviewing Paul Checkley from Harley Street Hearing and Musicians Hearing Services. So, hello Paul,
hello.
How are you doing? Good?
Good, thanks, yeah.
Okay, so we're making a video all about ears, and so I thought we'd start with the basics of what is sound and how the ear works. So I don't know if you could just take us through kind of what happens when these vibrations in air, in a gas basically, go into our ears.
Well, we have an outer ear which is almost like a funnel, and that funnels those little vibrations down into our ear canal. And there they find the eardrum. The eardrum is a elastic membrane which moves back and forward. Attached to the eardrum on the other side are some little bones. These little bones vibrate that like a transformer, because we're now going to transform those little vibrations from the air into a fluid-filled medium, which is our cochlea. This is the business end of our hearing. And inside the cochlea, those little sound waves move some little cells up and down, and as those cells move, they become displaced, and that's what sends an impulse to our brain that we recognise as a sound.
Right. So the cochlea is like that snail-like organ in the inner ear, and those sensory hair cells, you say like a piano keyboard. So is there any difference at either end of the cochlea, sort of high frequencies, low frequencies?
Absolutely. So if we draw that analogy back to the piano key, it's actually the opposite way round. So the high frequency sensors, if you like, are at the front, and then at the apex, which is at the other end, is where we hear the low frequencies.
Yeah. So I suppose the higher frequencies, higher and mid frequencies, get more of a battering. If you say those vibrations are coming in to the cochlea through the fluid, those sensory hair cells are getting quite a battering at the high end.
It would tend to be the high frequencies which would get affected first. Yeah.
And do we find with what sort of frequencies do you usually see music-induced hearing loss?
So music in general, as with any noise, is a broadband frequency. So we hear lots of different pitches while we're listening to music, rather than a specific frequency. And when we have a broadband input, that's a lot of different pitches. We characteristically see a dip in the high frequencies. It's usually around 4 kilohertz.
Right.
It can extend either side depending on the amount of damage, but usually around 4 kilohertz is where it first starts to show, which is a relatively high, similar to the sound of an S or a T.
Right. So do you find that people have problems in certain situations with conversations? If you say that, say constant sounds, do they?
Absolutely. So what you would generally find, the early stages of a noise-induced type loss would be that maybe you don't hear quite so clearly when you're with friends in a restaurant, because what we're missing there are, as we say, the high frequency consonants. So things like t and k and s. And these are extremely important sounds when we're actually trying to understand what people are saying. So we may hear that people have spoken, but we're not always quite sure what they've said.
Okay. So sensory hair cells excite the cochlear nerve through to the auditory nerve to the brain. So I suppose really, in actual fact, you're kind of hearing with your brain. Is that right? The ear is more of a mechanism of
transmission of sound. If we get into the realms of acoustics versus psychoacoustics, so acoustics is the transmission of sound and the movement of sound through a medium, and psychoacoustics is what happens or how we react to that sound when we perceive it in our brain.
Okay. What sort of frequencies, going back to music-induced hearing loss, what sort of instruments are usually are those kind of frequencies that could cause damage more so?
All of them.
All of them?
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's nothing specifically that would cause damage more than others, because it's all about the length of duration of the sound and the level. So if you have a sound at a particular frequency, the damage in the cochlea is usually 1 octave above that frequency.
Okay.
So if I played a 1 kilohertz tone to you very, very loud for an extended period, you would usually have damage at 2 kilohertz.
That's interesting.
So on a broadband signal, when we have a 3 kilohertz resonant peak in the ear canal, that's why we always see it at 4 kilohertz, because we've got a broadband signal with an elevated peak at 3 kilohertz. So the damage is always shows at 4 first.
Right. So we're seeing more damage sort of in the mid frequencies, I suppose you say, sort of from 1 kilohertz upwards, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely.
And as you know, with my hearing, that I've got mild music-induced hearing loss and tinnitus, is that for years I was standing next to drummers. So I suppose cymbals, hi-hats, snare drums, I suppose, are sitting more in that frequency bandwidth, possibly?
They are, but it's more about the fact that those instruments are extremely loud.
Okay.
So when we're looking at how noise can damage our ears, there are two elements to it. The first is that a quieter noise, which goes on for a longer time, causes damage, or a shorter noise at a louder, shorter duration of noise. So we're looking at a kind of an average level in a room. Somebody who's working in a factory or playing in an orchestra, we're looking at the average level of that orchestra over a period of time. But we're also looking at each crash on the cymbal or each
as a peak. Yeah.
So we need to be ensuring that the levels, so the average level of that music is at a level that's not uncomfortable or could potentially cause damage. But we're also making sure that the peaks are not in themselves causing damage.
Right. So in terms of, it's amplitude or loudness of sound compared to the time is what you're saying.
Absolutely.
So if we were now looking at safe exposure times, what would we say? Say if we started at, say, I mean, I know myself that maybe a drum kit is around sort of 94, 97 decibels, but let's just go a little bit back. Let's go maybe at 85 dB, 85 decibels. What's your safe exposure time then? And then in increments, how does it change as you go up?
So the European regulations say that as an average daily dose, so we're talking about noise is cumulative. So if we on the tube on the way to work and that's at a certain level, and then we're going and playing in an orchestra for 3 hours and that's at a certain level, it kind of all adds together as a dose over the day.
Right.
So 85 dB is the European guideline for a safe, if the sound is below 85 dB, it's considered to be safe for 8 hours of every day. But because the decibel scale is a logarithmic scale, it has to be, because the difference between the quietest sound that we can hear and the loudest sound that we can tolerate is a huge scale, which would run from here down to Finchley Road Tube Station. So in order to make it manageable, we turn that into a logarithmic scale. Yeah. But the effect of that on our measurements means that if every 3 decibel increase in measured intensity doubles the loudness.
So it's twice as loud.
Every
3 dB, twice
as loud.
Yeah.
Therefore, if it's twice as loud, the safe exposure time is half as much. So if we go from 85 dB to 88 dB, we're doubling the loudness and therefore halving our exposure time. So we're already down to 4 hours. If we take that up to 91, another 3, we're going down to 2 hours, and up to 94, and we're down to 1 hour. So by the time we're up to sort of 100, 105, which a lot of amplified music, we're immediately unsafe as soon as we get into that environment.
Right. So if you think of an on-stage setup with backline guitar amps, bass amps, drum kit, you're probably looking around 97 to 100 dB. So that means that your safe exposure time without any protection is about 15 minutes.
Yeah, roughly.
That's pretty crazy. I wish I knew that 25 years ago.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
and you may have rehearsed already on that day.
Yeah, exactly.
And you may have also travelled along a very, very noisy street on your way to work. So it's
your exposure dose, if you like,
for the day.
For the day.
Yeah.
So probably not a lot of musicians and singers, especially standing at the front of the band, would understand necessarily or be aware that their safe exposure time is quite short if you take into consideration rehearsals, studio sessions, live gigs, etc., and their environmental noise. It's not very long at all.
It's not long at all. No. Almost as soon as they're on stage, they're already at risk.
So let's move on to hearing protection. So we've seen how the ear can be damaged, how long you've got. let's talk about hearing protection. Obviously, there's various types of hearing protection on the market,
Yeah.
Of which ACS make universal and custom fit. So, I mean, what are we trying to do with hearing protection for musicians, especially for singers?
So the problem with hearing protection as such, in effect, most people have heard of little foam plugs that you can put into ears. You see them all the time. And the problem with those is that they will attenuate some frequencies more than others, and they'll generally damp down more in the high frequencies than they will in the low frequencies. So when you put those things on, it's quite difficult already to understand what people are saying to you, because we're dumbing down some of those high-pitched sounds, which we've already said are quite important when we're listening to people speaking. But also as a musician obviously, or a singer, has to be hear the music exactly as to hear all frequencies appropriately, at a good fidelity. So the ideal type of plug for that environment would be, and for that particular user, a singer or musician, would be something which allowed them to hear the music in exactly the same way, but just reduce the level. Yeah, in effect, turn the volume down.
Which is what they call attenuation. Attenuating hearing protection, whether it's a universal fit ear plug or a custom fit, is better for musicians.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right. So I know an ACS, we make different levels of attenuation, which is different filters that turn it down, if you like, a certain amount, or reduces the sound pressure. But some people find a bit of a problem if they're turning down the sound too much outside of in their outside environment. When they sing, it's a bit like sticking your fingers in your ears.
Absolutely.
And
we
you
call
get
that
this
occlusion.
The occlusion effect. Okay.
That's a build-up of low-frequency energy in the ear canal, and that's a perfect example. When you put your fingers in your ears, you get this build-up. You hear yourself internally.
Right.
And that's a big problem for brass players,
Yeah.
woodwind players, and obviously singers who can be more aware of their internal sound than the sound that's actually coming.
So what's happening there? Is it the vibrations are going through
the internal vibrations are being and the low frequency energy of those vibrations are being sort of held in by the plugs in the ears.
Yeah. Does that cause a problem for some singers? I mean, some singers, you stick your finger in your ear to try and if you're singing a 2-3 part harmony, but some singers find that their intonation, pitching wise, because it's a bit of a problem if they've got too much
because
attenuation.
they're too aware of what's going on inside. Okay. We're lucky enough to have filters at different levels. We can choose the filter appropriately to match the needs of the individual, but generally speaking, with a singer, you would tend to fit a slightly lower attenuation level, which will give a singer more feeling of, or less feeling of occlusion, so it makes everything feel a bit more open. And
what sort of levels of attenuation are you looking at? I mean, with the ACS filters, there's a 10 dB, 15 dB, 17 dB, 20 dB. What sort of level would you...
We would tend to go below 15.
Below 15.
With singers, I always say that to them, that it's better, if you can, to have a higher level, depending on what they do. If they're, particularly if they're in a rock band or whatever, it's going to be loud. I say to them, and we allow them to trial different levels. So, and I always say choose a higher one, because if you can, it would be good to have a higher level. So I would say maybe start them at a 15, but if they're not finding that easy to use, then we can always drop them down to a 10 or whatever.
So we've talked about universal fit earplugs, which look like Christmas trees, or they can have a memory foam type arrangement, or the custom moulded ones, which are custom made for your ears. ACS are obviously made from a soft silicon
which is
material.
Ideal because it moves. Obviously, singers move in their jaw quite a lot. Quite often, actually, with singers, we will have them take. Because as your mouth moves, also your ear canal moves. So what some singers find is, as they're singing, they get a vent through their plug. So we would tend to take the impression of the ear, which we do with a soft silicone paste, with their mouth open. So that when they're on stage, they're not getting this break in their seal.
So soft silicone.
Same with in-ear monitors.
Yeah, soft silicone is a lot better.
Absolutely, yeah.
Let's just talk about the ear impression process. So you have to have a mould taken of your ear. Do you just want to take us through, just briefly, how that's done at Harley Street?
Yeah, so it's a small foam or cotton bud, we call it, or it's called an otostop. It fits into the ear canal. A bit like a cotton bud with a piece of cotton attached to it. The
yeah.
cotton wool bit of a cotton bud with
Okay.
with a piece of cotton attached to it. So when that goes into manufacture, it's useful during the manufacturing process if we can get if the person who's manufacturing that earplug knows as much about that ear canal as they possibly can.
So is it, we usually say up to the second bend.
Second bend.
In the
So the
auditory
ear canal is,
yeah.
if you look down on someone's head, the ear canal is like an S laying on its side. And we have the first bend, and then we come into the second bend, and we try and get just around that second bend, so you know exactly what's happening in that ear canal. And that's pushed in with a little thing called a pen light, and then an auto light. And then we use a soft silicone. It's called an addition reaction silicone. It's basically a soft silicone paste, which is put in using a little device. And we literally filling the ear with a soft silicone, which takes 2 or 3 minutes to set.
So it's
Totally
like a
painless.
plasticine mould of
Pretty much
your ears.
Pretty much. Yeah.
So then ACS, we get those. We then scan that with a laser and create a 3D model. So then we have a 3D model of the person's ear, and then we 3D print that to make the mould, and then inject the silicone into it, which is quite good because also we have everybody's ears on file.
Absolutely, and they lose them all the time.
So we can remake them.
So you can reorder by phone.
Is that right? The ear continues to grow for your entire life.
It
So
does.
yeah. So
it does.
do you need to have?
Unfortunately, in my case,
Is it more so with men than women?
No, it's not.
No, really.
No, it's not.
Okay.
But
you see a lot of guys with big ears. Is that to
Yeah.
compensate for selective hearing?
But you do, yeah. Your ears do continue to grow.
Okay.
But we would say roughly, and I think your laboratory people would say the same thing. Around every 4 to 5 years, you should
Okay.
think to have them remoulded. The other thing is with oils of the skin and so on and use, it's probably as well to replace your filters at the same time. So we would advise people 4 to 5
Every
years.
4 years.
Yeah, they would get some new ones done.
Brilliant. Okay. So custom hearing protection is the best way to go. A custom fit soft silicone hearing protector earplug is probably, you would say, is best. Price point wise for that, well, I know the ACS ones, but we're probably looking at around £140.
140 to 170 pounds. Yeah.
And that includes having the ear impressions
done,
taken, which is why, and it's great news that's just happened actually recently, is the charity Help Musicians UK have launched a new scheme or a new campaign called the Musicians Hearing Health Scheme, which is to subsidise the cost of hearing protection for musicians, which is fantastic.
Amazing. It's such a good offer.
Yeah.
So it's something that the initial, the driver behind it was raising awareness among musicians, because some aren't aware that the potential risks of hearing damage from loud music. But it gives access to really good custom fitted hearing protection at a fraction of the price. So plus a hearing assessment and some advice from an audiologist on appropriate hearing protection for appropriate levels, and some advice about the European regulations and so on. So it's looking at, rather than just providing earplugs, it's looking at it's about looking after your ear health.
Hearing conservation, which is really important. Yeah. And there's more information, I believe, at hearformusicians.org.uk.
Absolutely.
And they can apply. Musicians can apply online.
Yeah, there's an online application form, and you'll hear within 3 to 5 days whether you've been successful.
Okay.
You just need to show that you're earning a percentage of your income from music,
which is fantastic.
Yeah.
So they get a one-to-one hearing assessment and a hearing test.
Yeah.
And then you guys would take the moulds, and then they get
provide them with the plugs. Yeah.
ACS hearing protection. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Just talking very briefly about, I know a lot of our viewers from iSing magazine will be teaching the next generation of singers and music makers, and as you know, I feel quite passionate about this because of the hearing damage that I've got, and also my tinnitus. That hearing conservation and raising this awareness in education is the key.
Yeah.
What are your feelings on that?
Absolutely. I know that we've been, in fact I was at a meeting yesterday with Help Musicians looking at the moment, students specifically are not eligible for the scheme simply because of they're not earning a percentage of. But obviously, as you say, it's an important group, because if we start them young with the idea of protecting their ears, they'll carry that through their careers. So,
with the right sort of hearing protection, because obviously,
absolutely,
because they still want to hear the music. I suppose if you can be using foam earplugs, they're going to have a bad experience of using hearing protection.
And put them off.
Yeah.
So we've been looking at schemes for what you might call emerging musicians, because obviously there are also lots of young musicians who maybe aren't at music college or are not in music education, who are also going to be embarking on a career in music. So it's looking at the young people joining the industry.
Because I mean, my generation as a musician, I worked professionally 15 years. I went through the music education system, if you like, music at school, O-level music, there you go, that's how old I am, A-level degree, even 2 years at the BBC. Nobody said that I could be damaging my hearing. Do you think, which I feel quite angry about, and even in the industry, nobody mentioned it. We just thought you'd come off stage and you'd have that muffledness. You know, your hearing's gone all muffled. What's that called?
This is something we call temporary threshold shift.
Yeah.
So obviously we talked earlier on about the little vibrations travelling through the fluid of the cochlea. If those are very big vibrations, and there's a lot of displacement of the membranes, we get some temporary damage to those membranes and to the cells which are responsible for transmitting the sound. We call that temporary threshold shift. It usually, and that will be when you leave a noisy environment, you feel a bit dull, the ears may be ringing muffled, slightly.
I remember years of that.
Absolutely. That takes maybe 24 to 48 hours to return, so the cells kind of restore themselves. The problem is that with continued exposure, with this continually happening, in the end they don't begin to restore themselves, or they restore themselves only to a percentage of their former level. So it's about continuing the exposure and causing more damage as you continue it. And once the damage is done, once that temporary threshold shift becomes permanent, that is it.
And they die off.
They die, and there is no cure, or they won't return.
And also temporary ringing. I mean, with my tinnitus, it would go away after a gig. Maybe the next day it would have gone away, and then I always remember having a 2-week holiday, and it didn't go away. But that temporary ringing, is that also, that temporary tinnitus, is that also a sign that the sensory hair cells are being damaged in the cochlea?
100%. You can think of that dull hearing and that temporary ringing, or the ringing sound, you can think of that as your body telling you that you were in an environment that was too loud for your ears. Yeah.
So if you are coming off stage and you've got that muffledness, temporary threshold shift, temporary tinnitus, temporary ring, you know that you've temporarily damaged your
ears,
hearing.
and
so that's
hopefully not permanently.
Yeah. So going back to education is the key. We need to be, installing this into mainstream education, surely. I mean, obviously when, and as you say, not all musicians would go through formal further or higher education. So really, telling kids about this at school is paramount.
Yeah, absolutely. What you were saying earlier on about nobody told you. It's interesting that the first piece of research which showed that noise can actually damage your hearing wasn't until about 1965.
Really?
And in the UK, the first, and it wasn't a law at the time, and it's only relatively recently that it's become law. The first sort of guidance on noise damage wasn't until the kind of early to mid 70s.
Right.
So, and I think the problem with musicians and music is that when we talk about noise damage, we always talk about noise damage. You mentioned earlier on hearing conservation, which is actually a much better term, because we don't think of that as a noise because we like listening to it.
Noise is an unwanted sound.
Absolutely,
if you like.
but any sound, if it's at the right level, but if it's music or whatever it is, it's going to do the same damage.
Singing teachers out there, it would be great to sort of challenge them and say, inform the next generation of singers and music makers.
Had they thought about the possible damage of hearing? Yeah, absolutely.
So if you're coming off stage and you've got that muffledness, that ringing in the ears, and that proves, as you say, that there is some temporary or permanent damage, what should they do next? What should musicians do next?
So here, noise-induced hearing loss is a bit of an invisible threat. It's not something that you will necessarily notice in all environments. There'll be some environments which you're finding maybe you're not hearing quite so well when you with friends in a restaurant, or and this without noise-induced damage can happen without tinnitus. People just need to be aware of any changes in their hearing if they are experiencing tinnitus. Is that permanent? If there are any changes to your hearing, you think you may be experiencing tinnitus, ringing or hissing in your ears, you should get to your GP, and your GP will hopefully refer you on to a specialist in the area, an ENT surgeon or a specialist audiologist.
Because I know that some colleagues and people in the industry, not knocking GPs, but they sometimes have a bit of a bad experience. GPs, from what, I don't know if this is true or not, but their training in audiology is sometimes, unless they've expressed an interest in it, they don't really have an awful lot of training when they do their GP training in audiology. So would it be better, what I'm trying to say is, would it be better to try and get yourself self-referred onto an audiologist, or maybe even go to a specialist like Harley Street Hearing?
Yeah, I mean, if you see an audiologist, the audiologist will be able to test your hearing. They'll be able to look at your noise history, and they'll be able to give you some advice about, at least some advice about where to go next. Okay. And some specialist tests to look, has there been permanent damage done to the ear, and if so, where's the best place to go next?
All right. So seeing a specialist is the best.
Absolutely.
Is the best. Yeah. Okay. So we've talked about signs of how the damage could have already happened, or warning signals, if you like, with that muffledness, the ringing in your ears. And obviously, hearing damage is not just for older people, is it? It can happen. I mean, I know myself, we work in Ibiza with a lot of DJs there, and I've spoken to a lot of young DJs in their mid-20s that have already got problems with their
It's absolutely not
hearing.
An old people's thing.
So really, protecting yourself, or being aware of the information that you've just given us about exposure time, exposure levels, and really protecting yourself early is important.
We were talking earlier on about what might be the signs that you have a noise-induced hearing loss. If we have signs of noise-induced hearing loss, it's almost too late.
Really?
Because by noise-induced hearing loss, we can't do it, we can't cure it, it's permanent. So really the key here has to be, as you say, understanding that if sounds, music, noise are loud, they will damage your ears. So you need to be getting in early before the damage happens.
Right. So protect yourself before it's too late.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Paul, from Harley Street Hearing. Very important advice there about hearing conservation and protecting your hearing before it's too late. We talked about the Musicians Hearing Health Scheme run by Help Musicians UK. Obviously, you have to apply to get onto that project. However, ACS Custom, Harley Street Hearing and Musicians Hearing Services are also offering iSing members a discount, which you can find out more information about that on the members area on the iSing magazine website. So if you're serious about sound and want to protect your hearing, you really need to play safe now so you can still hear tomorrow.